Welcome to Physiology Unraveled. I am your host, Jorge Granados, here with my co-host, Dr. Joe Watso. Today, we're joined by Dr. Greg Grosicki. Greg is a human physiologist, experienced triathlete, and senior research scientist at WHOOP. In this episode, Greg walks us through a recently published study where he and his colleagues analyzed nearly 2 million nights of sleep data from over 20,000 WHOOP users in order to unpack what may be the most overlooked metric in your wearable device, that is, the heart rate variability coefficient of variation, or HRVCV. He explains what HRVCV actually tells you about recovery, stress, and your long-term cardiovascular health. We dig into behaviors like alcohol, physical activity, and sleep timing, and how these behaviors change this metric, and why HRVCV changes so differently between men and women as they age. By the end of this episode, you'll know how to interpret your HRV, what lifestyle habits stabilize your physiology, and how to implement this data to improve your performance and health span. If you find this episode helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep you up to date and helps us keep the lights on. Let's jump into the conversation with Dr. Greg Grosicki.
Yeah, so Greg, in Heart, a very prestigious journal in cardiovascular physiology, you had some data, large data set, looking at the heart rate variability coefficient of variation and looking at that during sleep and how that's changed by both behavior and also between males and females and over the course of the lifespan with aging. So I guess just first off, I'll let you sort of just take it from big picture. What were the main findings? And you have the floor to sort of just talk about the paper in general.
Yeah. So I think maybe one of the coolest things about this paper is there's strong alignment with the mission of WHOOP and the way WHOOP has gone as just a company. We were founded in 2012 on a mission to unlock human performance. And if you look at some of the very early adopters of WHOOP, Cristiano Ronaldo, Michael Phelps, some leading NBA basketball players, tennis players all around the world, we were truly working with the most elite performers in the entire world. But then just this year with the launch of our 5.0, we kind of changed that mission to now we're on a mission to unlock human performance and health span. And I think that, again, there's really strong alignment with the foundation of this paper and the kind of question that we were seeking to answer. I believe, and I think a lot of the research that Joe and I have done together, there's a lot that the average Joe, no pun intended, can learn from some of the most elite athletes in the world, right? The tracking of heart rate variability, for instance, or the mainstream tracking of heart rate variability began in athletes as a way to assess training monitoring and training status and adaptation. And this paper really sought to understand the importance or lack thereof of one of those metrics that's really hasn't made it to the mainstream yet. WHOOP's hero metric is heart rate variability. And we all know that, or most of us probably know that that's described as the variation in time between successive heartbeats. Kind of people who aren't really deep in the field would try to think that, oh, if your heart's beating 60 times in a minute, it's beating very rhythmically. But that's actually not the case, particularly as we breathe in and breathe out, our heart speeds up and slows down, and it creates this variability between beats. And by and large, greater variability is good. Now, there are some pathologic cases where if someone has some sort of arrhythmia or atrial fibrillation, that would create this excessive variability that isn't good. But by and large, within a person, outside of any sort of pathologic complications, greater variability is good. And so within a person, looking at someone's heart rate variability can be very useful. That being said, comparing it between people does create a bit of a problem. There are plenty of 50, 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds on the WHOOP platform who don't do a whole lot of exercise, who have heart rate variabilities of 110 or 120 milliseconds. Whereas, for instance, my heart rate variability on average is probably somewhere closer to 50 to 60 milliseconds. The fact that my HRV or heart rate variability is half of theirs doesn't necessarily mean that I'm any less healthy. And as a matter of fact, we know that there's both genetic and lifestyle components to heart rate variability, and that they may contribute differently to disease and mortality. So when we're looking at heart rate variability and trends and comparing between people, there's certainly a certain amount of caution that is warranted when we're just interpreting those trends. Now, another way to think about when we're thinking about heart rate variability, right, it kind of becomes complex because what are we asking is what is a variation in time between heartbeats? The heart rate variability coefficient of variation simply looks at what is again, another metric of variation, the day-to-day variation in the variation. So let me put it really simply. If I had one individual who had a heart rate variability, every single day they wake up and it's 60, 60, 60, 60, 60, 60. They would have almost no variation, a very small coefficient of variation in their HRV, right? The coefficient of variation is calculated as the standard deviation divided by the mean. On the other hand, if I woke up and I had someone and one day it was 40 and then 80 and then 40 and then 80 and then 40 and then 80, those people would have the same 7-day mean in heart rate variability, but one of them, it was literally zero variation or a very low coefficient of variation, and the other, it was jumping all over the place. And so they would have very different HRV CVs. And so for a real life analogy of the practical utility of this, I like to give the example of, say we had two boats that left a port in Boston and they were sailing across the Atlantic Ocean over to the United Kingdom. One of the boats, they, put it in second gear. It's a big, robust boat. They have a expert crew. They don't really hit any inclement weather or rough waters. No one gets sick, and they make it to the UK in, let's say, 4 days. The other boat, it's a bit older. Someone gets sick on the crew. They hit some really rough waters. And so they may make it in 5 days, but some days they're really having to move it into fourth or fifth gear. Other days they're having to dial back and fix the engine because it broke. One night they were up all night just to make it overseas at the same time, right? They were having this race. They both made it at the same time, which would be a reflection of they have the same heart rate variability. But now that they're there, if they had one more day where they had a race, which one do you think is going to win? Well, probably the boat that made it easier, right? It has much more in reserve. It's much fresher. The other boat, it's been beaten, it's been battered, people have been sick, they've been through rough waters. And really, that's how our physiology could look, right? Like if we're training for an event, our body's steady and resilient across the week. On the other hand, maybe someone's, getting woken up in the middle of the night because they're a kid and they're having to take naps during the day to compensate for that. Or they have a really stressful time at work, and so one day they, have a ton of life stress, and the next day they have to really de-stress because of that. Those people are not necessarily on level playing fields, and in my opinion, that's the value of the heart rate variability, a coefficient of variation. Now, prior to this study, no one had really investigated this in large-scale data. As a matter of fact, I think the largest data set maybe it had been used in, it was certainly less than 40 people. And that was a study that Andrew Flatt and I did when we were at Georgia Southern, and it was probably even less than that. There's a case study by one of my co-authors on the paper, Dan Plews, and he and Martin Buchheit and Paul Larson, who's also on the paper, did some stuff with this back in the 2010s. Very small athletic samples, elite swimmers, futsal players, football players, and Andrew Flatt was studying in college athletes, but no one had sought to really understand the significance of this metric just in the general population. And so that's what we did. We studied almost 2 million nights from over 20,000 people and looked at relations between this heart rate variability coefficient of variation and their behaviors. We looked at how this metric changes across the lifespan, and then we looked for differences between people with lower and higher body mass index.
Yeah, that was a great description and a justification for the outcomes. And I'm curious then, could you talk a little bit about the change in this metric over the course of a lifespan? And then from there, you can sort of get into differences between males and females. And there's obviously some behavioral things that you can do. And the WHOOP obviously tracks activity. So I assume that has a role as well. So could you talk a little bit about what you found?
Yeah. And if you wouldn't mind, Joe, I'm going to switch those around. I want to start with the behaviors because I think they provide nice context to understanding the changes across the lifespan. So to start out with, we aggregated data by 7-day weeks. And the reason we did that is because the sports science studies, if you're tracking something like heart rate variability, a coefficient of variation, you can't really do it in a single day. You need a multi-day period. And the sports science studies most often would use a 7-day period. And there's good rationale for that. We know there are keen behavioral differences from a weekday versus weekend. We know that athlete training blocks are generally structured across a 7-day period. And so that's how we looked at it in our data. And a reviewer actually asked about this. And just to be transparent, we don't know for sure that 7 days is better necessarily than 14 or 21 or month long, but we do know that that's what we did. So we looked at it across 7-day periods. And then we looked at relations between heart rate variation, HRV, CV, and what I call the big four, which are the behaviors we know that have the greatest effect on biometrics. And WHOOP measures these during sleep. And those are drinking alcohol, physical activity, sleep duration, and then sleep consistency. 3 of those are pretty self-explanatory. The one that people may be less familiar with is sleep consistency, which is WHOOP's metric, but it's very similar to something like sleep regularity, which people may be more familiar with. And basically, it's looking at consistency of sleep onset and sleep offset timing. So if someone goes to bed and wakes up at the same time, they would have very high sleep consistency. We score this using a percentage from 0 to 100. If they go to bed and wake up at the exact same time, it'd be 100. If their bed and wake times are all over the place, it'd be much lower. And so we looked at relations between HRV, CV, and those 4 behaviors. We saw that drinking alcohol really increases HRV, CV. Being physically active lowers it. Having higher sleep duration lowers it. And then having high sleep consistency lowers it. And what was actually really interesting is we saw that compared to HRV, which is the metric that is our hero metric and most people's, HRV CV was actually more responsive to drinking alcohol, sleep duration, and sleep consistency, which really says that if we're just tracking HRV alone, we are missing something because we are actually going to get more insights into our behavior on an index of cardiac autonomic function with this HRV CV than HRV. And a reviewer actually keenly asked about resting heart rate, and we saw the same trends actually. And this is in the supplementary material, that HRV CV was more responsive to alcohol and those sleep patterns than resting heart rate, which is super cool because these are all metrics people can track. So I think that provides nice context to high HRV, generally, although not always bad. And we talk about this in the discussion, and I'd like to touch on it a little bit more after because I think this is nuanced. And then a lower HRV CV is good. So in that context, again, higher HRV CV, generally not good. Lower, generally good. What does it look like across the lifespan? With HRV, it's pretty well known. There's been a lot of very large cohort studies that have looked at changes in HRV across the lifespan. And our data were similar to those. From 20 to about 60 years of age, HRV generally goes down and substantially. It went from about 70 to about 25 milliseconds. So it's going down like 45 milliseconds from 20 to 70. That's a ton, right? Or 20 to 60. And then very interestingly, there's an uptick in people who are in their 70s or as they get older. Now, one explanation for that could be a survival bias where people who are less healthy are passing away. And so you have healthier people who are in these older age groups. I think that probably contributes some. And in our wearable data, I think the people who are in their 70s and willing to buy a WHOOP probably are more fit. And we even see that in our data set, actually. Our 70-year-olds exercise more than our 20-year-olds, which is pretty cool. But I don't actually think that fitness or survival bias is the probably biggest factor explaining this. I think, and this is discussed a lot in these larger epidemiological studies that see the same thing, I think it probably has more to do with arrhythmias that are happening and are far more likely in people who make it into this age, which, as we talked about, are increasing HRV, but probably not in a good way. So if anything, I think we're probably seeing a bit of an artificial signal, if we think about HRV as a measure of cardiovascular health, happening in these older age groups, where it actually goes up, which would suggest that prognostically maybe these people are more healthy, and indeed they might be. But in my opinion, they actually probably are more likely to have arrhythmias that mean that they're less healthy. And so I think this artificial, my suspicion is this uptick in HRV that happens kind of later in life is probably actually not a good thing. And so I think that's a big limitation if someone's tracking HRV across their life. You make it to 70, it goes up, you assume you're getting healthier, but does that actually mean you are? And we don't know for sure. But yeah. So then that brings us to HRV CV. And we did these models a couple of different ways. And this is one of the things we were talking about, Joe and I, with supplementary material. I don't think I'd ever really submitted supplementary material until now. But when you get out into all this big data, you almost have to. We did these models both with no covariates, not really controlling for any lifestyle factors. We talked about those big four: alcohol, activity, sleep duration, and sleep consistency. And then we redid them controlling for all of those things. And we did them both between and within person, because each of these people contributed 91 consecutive days of data, which is super cool. Wow. And so we're able to parse out the within and between person effects by controlling for those variables, which is pretty neat. But it didn't really matter. The story was pretty much the same. And one of the things that I think is most interesting is when you look at these biological signals with age by sex, generally they're relatively similar. And we can see that when we look at HRV. But I think you'd struggle to find a biological signal that's more disparate by sex as far as changes with age go than we see with HRV-CV. And I think that's very apparent in the plot. In females, as a matter of fact, HRV-CV actually went down, which in theory could be a good thing, from 20 to 30 to about 40 and 50 years of age. And then right at 50 years of age, which we know as scientists coincides with that menopausal transition happening between 40 and 50, HRV-CV started going up a little bit. So that's quite interesting. And we don't know that it's hormones. We didn't measure hormones. Again, big data, massive limitation, but it is interesting. Whereas in males from 20 to about 40 years of age, it was relatively consistent. It maybe crept up a little, but really nothing significant. We showed that there's no difference between 20 to 40. But then at 40 years of age, which also coincides with the time in life when males start seeing the greatest drop in their testosterone, HRV-CV starts to climb. What's interesting with this is we have higher HRV-CV starts to climb. HRV-CV is higher in males, particularly in younger, but also across the entire lifespan, which also mirrors what we know about cardiovascular disease. That in males, HRV-CV starts to climb about 40 years of age, where in females it's 50. And we know there's about a 10-year difference in the onset of cardiovascular disease or likelihood of onset and high blood pressure between males and females. And so we certainly can't say for sure, but it's very, very compelling. And I can't wait for future studies to follow up on this. Do these longitude, or what we're looking at is cross-sectional trends in HRV-CV correspond with that cardiovascular disease onset? And then going back to my earlier point with HRV, where it actually went up in the 70-year-olds. We're not seeing anything that's artificial in the 70-year-olds in HRV-CV. That is the period in these cross-sectional data, at least, where HRV-CV was the greatest. So again, perhaps we're getting something there with HRV-CV that we'd be missing if we just looked at HRV.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear that it does have a similar inflection point to other things like vascular function, which tends to decline, as you mentioned, pretty abruptly around the age of 50, which is around the age of menopause for most females. And then for males, just a little bit earlier. So that it does provide some strength or give you more confidence in what you're finding does sort of align with other things, even though it does have the cross-sectional aspect to it. And to sort of close the loop on the things that were measured for the main outcomes, could you talk about a body mass index as well? Because that was something else that you had derived from presumably people's self-reported height and weight.
Yeah, and that is a huge limitation. And one of the reviewers, now I know you're one of the reviewers, Joe. The reviewer actually called that out. They asked about that. It's a big limitation for sure because it is self-reported. But I think one of the advantages when you're dealing with 20,000 people is even if they're all off by just a tiny bit, you get this regression to the mean where people's body mass index probably was pretty similar to what it would actually be in real life. And what we saw, and this is particularly interesting, and this is a case where it's really good that we ran both unadjusted and adjusted models. In the unadjusted models, which are in the supplements, both in males and females, HRV-CV increased with increasing body mass index, such that BMI in people with a lower BMI had a lower HRV-CV, folks with overweight had a higher, and folks with obesity had an even higher HRV-CV. What's really interesting is when we controlled for all those lifestyle behaviors, in females, the association between body mass index and HRV-CV was significantly attenuated, which suggests, again, going back to that behavioral component of why we're kind of disappointed in that, okay, maybe it's not body mass index driving this association, but we know HRV-CV is so strongly tied to these behaviors. What maybe we have mostly going on, and this is what the data would suggest, right, is that in females with overweight and obesity, the reason they have a higher HRV-CV is because of their behaviors, right? They're exercising less, they're drinking more alcohol, and their sleep patterns are poor. The association was also attenuated in males, although not to the same extent. So I do think there probably is an association between, BMI at least, and I can't wait to test this in more robust body comp measures, things like DEXA, between body comp and HRV-CV. But we know a lot of it is probably driven by lifestyle, which kind of goes back to the whole, the importance of lifestyle, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, that's a neat segue. So I guess the takeaway is that there are some genetic predispositions, and your current body mass index can have an association, at least with HRV-CV, but still your healthy behaviors, even if you don't lose weight or improve that BMI, it seems that you do still have a better HRV-CV outcome.
Yeah, we
so
did look.
One
more so we have like these longitudinal data for this fellow who lost 100 pounds and then went from kind of being physically inactive to doing the triathlon, and looking at his HRV-CV over this 3-year weight loss journey, and it significantly went down, and we even looked at a correlate there. It was very cool. So anyway, again, that could be lifestyle as well, but we actually see a stronger correlation between his body weight and HRV-CV than any of these lifestyle behaviors. So
takeaway, maintain a healthy body weight, or try to get to a healthier body weight if possible for to improve this metric.
And HRV-CV might be a guiding path to getting to that healthier body weight.
Yes.
Keep it low, and you're probably practicing better behaviors.
To kind of follow up on that, you mentioned that HRV-CV, whenever you're looking at age, the males started kind of slightly going up at around the same age when it correlates to testosterone going down. Any data on that, or any futures potential looking at data of like potential, testosterone and HRV-CV? Because that also, my mind's thinking, okay, well, the BMI you're looking at, right? You see, when I'm looking at this figure right now for BMI, you're looking at the males going kind of up, and then it kind of plateaus right around 25 BMI. So I'm wondering if, again, lower testosterone, as that goes up, you're increasing body fat, right? So usually. So I'm wondering your thoughts on that, and if you will be looking at any kind of data on that in the future.
Yeah, until about 2 weeks ago, I would say that that'd be something for Joe and his colleagues in the lab to figure out. But now that we have this advanced labs, that certainly falls back into our wheelhouse. So yeah, we have this advanced labs, that we talked about on the earlier podcast that we're doing through WHOOP. But members can upload their old data or go to a Quest and get new data for $150, 60 biomarkers, and shows all the correlations, changes over time, as well as how those relate to people's WHOOP metrics. And one of the things that'll be super cool now is we'll even be able to look at within person, does HRV-CV track with these changes in testosterone? Wow. So be very cool to look at. Or even in, if you control for age, people who are all around that 40 to 50 years of age, do we see any relations between testosterone and HRV-CV?
Super cool.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I'm looking forward to. Maybe we'll have you come on the podcast.
I know what I'm going to do tomorrow at work.
Oh, there you go.
You just gave me an idea.
There you go. I'll take a co-authorship on that paper. I'm joking.
All right. We'll let you know.
Follow up on another thing, because you were talking about, controlling for different covariates and so forth. whenever you were looking at the age related, kind of those older individuals with arrhythmias, I don't know if I missed that on your explanation. Did you guys look at data on removing some of these arrhythmias and see how that data looked?
So WHOOP does, as of this year, have a AFib detection feature, which is super cool. But aside from that, we really don't have any data on arrhythmias and things like that. And so it wasn't something we were
Gotcha.
necessarily able to do.
Gotcha.
Yeah, the reviewer did ask, this is a good one. You'll see in the supplement, the reviewer asked me to get rid of the 70-year-old cohort. We don't have as many people in there. We need more older adults on WHOOP. We're getting them. And those numbers are growing. But the reviewer did ask me to remove the 70-year-old cohort and then redo the nonlinear models just to show that the trends held. So you'll see in the supplement there's one without the 70 to 79-year-olds.
Gotcha. Interesting. I actually like the way that you guys are depicting it because, and your explanation on potentially why we're seeing that rise again. So
yeah, if I could jump back in, I had a couple of questions regarding so with the methods, I saw the dates of March to May, and I guess I'm curious. I'll sort of lay a few things out there and then I'll see where you want to take it. So 1, why March to May? 2, during that time, presumably probably not all people, but most people had the spring forward time change. And is that something that was considered? And related to those things, do you think it'd be different over the course of a year or very seasonally if you were to extend it out to summer and winter months for I assume that this is United States based, or is it worldwide as well?
Yeah, this is worldwide. So,
okay.
Yeah, could be people everywhere. In some analyses, depending on the questions we're trying to answer, we will control for season because there is a tremendous seasonality in some of these metrics. Actually, Tony Wolf, Joe, who I know you know at UGA, and I are collaborating on something like that. He has data showing some pretty profound changes in some lab vascular measures with seasonality, and we know that increased risk for cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular mortality in the summer. And in people's WHOOP metrics, we see the same thing. Their resting heart rate goes up and HRV goes down. And so specifically trying to get at the question, do we see any associations between behaviors and the attenuation of those cardiovascular changes in the winter? And that's something that we are looking forward to doing and following up on more. Tony's going to kill me now. I'm giving away his questions. Here's the thing, though. I can say it, but no one else can answer these questions. So good luck to them. They can know what we're doing, but no one else has the data that we do. Anyway, those will come soon. So yeah, that's a great question. As far as the March to May goes, Joe, another good question. Was totally random, if I'm going to be honest with you. There might have been some reason I did it at the time, but yeah, I mean, there certainly could be seasonal trends. It's something that I would imagine will follow the other seasonal trends we see, where resting heart rate goes down in the summer months and then up in the winter, and HRV goes up in the summer months and down. I imagine from March to May, there was probably a slight reduction in HRV-CV just because people tend to get cardiovascularly healthier in the summer. So yeah, no, it's a good point. It's a good limitation. I did intentionally choose kind of this 3-month or 13-week period based on so that part wasn't random. When we think about training studies, we generally think of them being about 12 or 13 weeks because that's a time frame where you can have kind of these acute to moderate training adaptations going on. And so that was the reason I wanted people to have that window. And also in doing so, one of the things that's really interesting about this study is every person had continuous data. So they literally wore the WHOOP device every night, and we have every day's biometrics and every day's activity. And although people do wear the device a lot, if you extend the sampling time window out, it becomes way easier for someone to miss a day, which if you're using covariates, can kind of get messy. And so sometimes it comes to balancing, you'd love to have a longer period of study that would go the entire year. But then if you're looking for continuous data, the sample sometimes goes down. So yeah.
Yeah, that's good thoughts there. I'm very interested in, now that I know it's worldwide as well, just think about the seasonality, because then you have matched in time. So whatever's going on in the world is sort of, obviously we all get different information and have, unique experiences of life, but you can control for time, I guess, in a way, and look at the seasonality. So yeah, I'll definitely be interested to see those data. And to segue from that with the longer epoch, can you talk about a little bit, because this is another analysis that was in the paper, how short could you reduce that time horizon to? So if you had a race in on a Saturday and it was a Wednesday, is that there was 3 days enough time for you to sort of have an idea of your HRV CV with a good deal of confidence, or is it a little bit longer?
Yeah. So the duration of the sampling window is certainly something that needs to be flushed out, I think, more and through more extensive studies. I think the 7-day, again, based on those athlete studies, Andy Galpin is on this paper as well. And one of his like biggest critiques when he saw it is like, this paper is great. He's like, but why 7 days? Like, you need to justify this more. And I even put like a lot in to justify it and in the limitations. And it clearly didn't appease the reviewers because the reviewers still asked about it. And now we're talking about it now. So I do think like there needs to be more done in this space. We know from a lot of Dan Plu's seminal HRV studies comparing single-day HRV to 7-day rolling average HRV. The 7-day rolling average does a way better job at predicting adaptation, whereas single-day doesn't really do a good job at all at predicting adaptation. And so I think if we're looking at training adaptation, at least from these foundational studies, we know the 7-day rolling average works better, but there haven't been any studies, to my knowledge, that have looked at someone's HRV CV maybe over a year or a month. I would imagine there'd be lower noise in there, but there also might not be as much signal. But one of the kind of cool parts of this analysis, and Andrew Flatt had done this a little bit in some female soccer players, was he was looking at 7-day HRV and HRV CV, and there was missing data, as happens in athlete studies, and he went and did a basically missing days analysis just with the data he had, and he tried to answer the question, how many days do you need to reliably reflect 7-day HRV CV, which kind of sparked my like, okay, and this goes again to being an industry scientist, right, and thinking about like, okay, HRV CV, it's a really cool measure. It's been worked on in athletes. If we're going to bring it onto the WHOOP platform and surface this insight to members, how many days does a member need of data to have in a 7-day period before we feel comfortable in showing them that metric, right? Can we do it with 2? Can we do it with 3? And also it impacts, if a member gets on WHOOP, how many days of data do they need before we can get them the metric, which is always something we're struggling with, because the first day you get on WHOOP, it's a kind of unassuming experience. You put the strap on and you get no data, right? Because you haven't had a sleep yet. You haven't had any measures. And so that was one of the big questions we tried to answer. And so we ran this simulation where we took everyone's, for each person, we had, again, 13 weeks, and all of them were complete. So for each person, we calculated what someone's HRV CV would have been in each one of those weeks. And then we went through and we said, okay, now we're going to look at what happens if we randomly take 6 days from everyone's week, and so we exclude 1. And what happens if we do 5 and 4 and 3 and 2 and 1? And how does that reflect the reliability or the representativeness of the measure? And so again, we went from perfect 7 all the way down to 2. And initially we were kind of in between 2 and 4, and we decided a priori going in, we wanted to see interclass correlation coefficient greater than 0.80. 0.75 is generally kind of the standard in the literature for good. We wanted it to be a little higher than that. And truth be told, this would depend on what you're comfortable with as far as the interpretation of your data. But I said, okay, if it's greater than 0.80, it's probably going to be good. And it's kind of coincidental that I chose that, because when we were just looking at 4 days, and at first I was like, okay, 4 days, the ICC in men, or the interclass correlation coefficient, I think was, and it's in the table, I think it was 0.81, and women, it was 0.80. It's like, okay, this is like what we should use. We should go forward with it. Like if they have 4 of 7 days, we're good. 4 days someone's on the platform, show them their metrics. And then I was thinking about this a little bit more critically in the context of our data. And Emily Capodalupo, who's the SVP of data science, published a study in PLOS ONE a couple of years ago showing these profound weekday to weekend differences. And the data science team coming to my head and say, hey, Greg, you didn't control for weekday weekend differences. And I was like, man, like I have to actually do this more robustly. So I did a sensitivity analysis within the 6, 5, 4 day periods using a different combination of weekday, weekend. And sure enough, when you get rid of the weekends from the 4 day sampling window, the ICC drops to like 0.70 to 0.75. So it kind of fell under that acceptable association with the full 7 day metrics. Meanwhile, if we use 5 days, even if they're only weekdays, the ICC was, I think, 0.8 0.85 in men and 0.83 in women, something like that. It was far greater than we were seeing with the 4 days. And so we concluded that if you have 5 days, any 5 days of the 7 days, you're probably okay to surface this metric. If you go with our logic of having an ICC of greater than 0.80. And so for that reason, we conclude that if you have 5 of 7 days or any 5 days of the week, the metric might be usable.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. It's really nice also to hear the story of how you got to that value with the weekends and weekday analysis, because a lot of times if we think about, you just go into this analysis and every step of the way, but it's good that there's the iteration of finding the right answer that's going to be correct as often as possible with rigor that's needed to address the market need. And it's also interesting to hear about the application of this knowledge to actually for the user, because in actuality, you're trying to be in service to the member. So like you said, you could provide them with the value at 2 days, but it's not going to be very useful for them if they want to make actionable changes from that. So thanks for sharing that. Jorge, did you have any follow-ups from that?
No, actually, that's great. And you read my mind, Joe, because I was going to ask a very similar question to that. So you mentioned actionable. And so, Greg, what actionable items would you recommend to somebody, let's say they don't have WHOOP? I'm thinking of myself whenever I was back in graduate school, and I might not be able to, afford WHOOP at the time. So if you take anything of this, if you're listening to podcasts, what are some of the, or maybe your top actionable item that you would suggest?
Yeah. So the first thing that's actionable is that WHOOP is free for everyone for 30 days. So you can get on the website and try it out, right? Oh, what a
Not a
sales
plug.
pitch that was, right?
Not a plug,
This
by
is
the
not
way.
a plug. Yeah, I don't get a cent from this. But anyway, WHOOP is free for 30 days. So try it out. And if you don't like it, fine. But that's pretty cool. So, it is a subscription, right? But you get the band free or the strap free for 30 days. Get all of your metrics. You can even calculate your own HRV-CV. ChatGPT is real good at doing it, and hopefully WHOOP will be too. Actually, WHOOP does have like an AI coach, and I've been like talking to it so much that now I can just tell it, like, give me my HRV-CV, and it just spits it out. So I've like
Really
trained
cool.
my AI coach in WHOOP to, yeah, so that's fun. I think one thing that is super important when we're thinking about, both HRV and HRV-CV in the context we described is that like higher HRV and lower HRV-CV is not always better, right? Like think about some of the nuance we were talking about this, where as you get older, higher HRV goes up. Is that good? Maybe not. Dan Plews published a case study. Actually, it was like there were like 3 athletes in it or 2 athletes in it looking at HRV and HRV-CV during a prolonged training block. And in one athlete, HRV just goes down the tank and HRV-CV actually goes down. And that athlete reached a state of non-functional overreaching and got very sick. And so that's a case where a low HRV-CV is not always good. And so I think first and foremost, like, yes, in general, higher HRV is good, lower HRV-CV is good, but there's always nuance and context. So I think regardless, keeping that in mind. And then, I think when we're thinking about these metrics, there's, I think, kind of 2 ways to do it. And one is like, what do these metrics tell us about what we've done yesterday or over the previous week? And I think depending on the metric we choose, it's going to be better or possibly worse at telling us that, right? If we wake up and we look at single day values, they're probably going to be pretty good about telling me what I did yesterday, versus a 7 day might tell me more about what's happened the past week. But in my mind, the biggest value add of using a wearable or even just like a chest strap to look at these metrics is not that they tell you what to do in the future, which is what everyone wants from them, I think, but they tell you about and teach you about how your body is responding to things you've done in the past, which creates some like work for you, right? And people would rather just wake up and then have their wearable tell them what to do in the future. But the truth is, you probably know that way better than what your wearable does. But what it does tell you is it gives you deeper insight into how your past behaviors impact the person you are today. And you can use that information to change your behavior. And one of the things we see on WHOOP, probably the biggest effect of WHOOP is that people stop drinking alcohol as much. And the reason why is because every day you wake up and you see your heart rate's 5 or 10 beats per minute higher and your HRV is cut in half. Like seeing that every day shocks people enough that they're like, geez, I should probably stop drinking as much. And that's a perfect example of people using the data that people are getting from WHOOP and they're saying, wow, like this is like really impacting my health. I'm probably going to stop doing it as much. And in my mind, it's like the best way to possibly use it is not a, what does it tell me about what I need to do, but what does it tell me about what I've done, and then internalizing that and using it going forward. Now, just like all wearables, Whoop does have an AI coach like Aura, and it'll tell you what to do in the future. And I think there's a lot of good with that. It might surface some ideas or some strategies we don't know. For example, you get the advanced labs, your cortisol's high, your HRV's low. It might tell you something about your sleep consistency that we possibly didn't know about. I've like, now that our AI coach is getting more advanced, I can use it to compare months from 2025 to 2024 to 2023, which is pretty cool, rather than having to like get into my own data. And so that's I think really kind of nice to like see those trends and have it give me insights. But I think like being responsible connoisseurs of our data rather than just like listening to what exactly the wearable is telling us, I think is a big thing.
Yeah, thank you for that explanation. And that's great. One of the other things that I meant to ask earlier was you had mentioned that there was not a lot of the older population, in the 60s. My father, he goes on walks. He tries to eat healthier now. He's a little overweight and so forth. But I try to get him to go to the doctor, get regular checkups and so forth. And he's one of those that would rather not know. I'll just keep doing my thing. Any advice for the older population that might be hesitant to really know this stuff? Because as you alluded to, this might give you more work to analyze. It might get in your head or so forth. Yeah. How can somebody bridge that gap and be able to use this as a tool, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is nice about wearables is that they do help to, they collect a lot of data, which can be good and it could be bad. If done right, I think they help to distill that information in ways that are actionable. And I don't think that we've always done this very well in the past, but I do think, and frankly, a lot of its advancements in AI, we're getting way better at it. And the Whoop user interface is pretty darn cool. There is a lot of data in it, and there are sometimes we don't do a good job, but I think we are getting way better at like giving the one or two nuggets and personalizing people's recommendations based on where they're at, right? We're stupid if we're telling someone who is not exercising at all that they need to start exercising 300 minutes. That would be dumb. Or like, for instance, my sleep, is by and large very poor. Like I sleep probably about 6 hours a night. And so Whoop isn't telling me I need to go sleep 8 hours. It's saying, try to get 6.5 or try to get 7. Is again, really making it more personalized, which I think is nice. And these devices are at a place now where they're helping for people who aren't as entrenched in this and might be a little bit more naive. I think it does provide a nice like kind of beginner level explanation for some of this material, and maybe it tells them things to focus on that they've never thought about, right? Like, for example, sleep consistency. We all know about the importance of sleeping enough a night, but what most people don't know, even who have sleep consistency, is that probably actually matters more than how much they're sleeping. Mine's quite good. So that's a whole nother story. That's super cool. Yeah. But one thing we see on the platform, and like I see because I have the cool job of like analyzing data from guys who are like in the Tour de France, is that the fittest human beings on earth go to bed and wake up at about the exact same time every day. And the fitness declines, the variability in sleep timing goes way up. So anyway, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, that's great. I know he agrees with that. I know he goes to sleep and gets up at the same time pretty much every day. So
yeah, a few more years and I'll be a Tour de France quality. No, just recreational
correlation
for life.
Is not causation, Joe.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, thanks so much. Congrats again on the paper. It's very interesting. Is there anything in closing, wrapping up the episode, that you wanted to mention that we didn't get to today?
No, thanks so much for having me on, guys. The paper will be available on AJP Heart website, open access. So check it out if you're interested. Great. Thanks. ChatGPT can calculate your HRV-CV if you don't know how to do it. So there you go.
I'm going to go do that. So I'm going to have to go get me a Whoop as well. So yeah.
There you go. 30 days free.
There you go. Now, Greg, thank you so much again. Like Joe said, we appreciate your time and insights. Link to the paper on this. Anyway, for those of you listening, again, hopefully you found this helpful. You can reach out to Greg on LinkedIn if needed. As always, remember to keep asking questions, stay curious, and keep unraveling physiology. So, till next time, we'll see you guys later.